Okay, this is Grandpa's. We'll talk about his early life first. Okay, Grandpa, go ahead and just talk and say your name and when you were born and where you were born.
My name is Perry Douglas Van Dorn. I was born in Oak Creek, Colorado, Rock County, of course, July 16th, 1916. And at that time, Oak Creek was a pretty tough mining town. They just had a big strike up there, and they called in the National Guard, and they couldn't handle it, so they finally sent in federal troops and got the strike settled. I don't know exactly how they settled it, but they did. And about 3 weeks after that, my mother brought me down to Craig, and I've lived here ever since.
What's your mother's name and your father's?
Myrtle Brian Van Dorn.
And your father?
Carl Douglas Van Dorn.
Do you know their birth dates?
Mother was born September 24th, 1883 in Silver Cliff, Colorado. Dad was born the 21st of November, 1885 in Hardington, Nebraska.
What is your earliest memory that you can think of?
Well, the first one that I can really pinpoint is the day this picture behind me was taken. And that was in August of 1918. It was an eclipse of the sun. And why we went up on top of the sand rocks to see it, I don't know, but we did. But before we went up, we smoked some pieces of broken glass to look at the eclipse through. They say that's a no-no now, but that's all we had, so that's what we did. We smoked them over the lamp chimneys and got them as dark as we could. One thing that I remember about that day was as we going up the left side of the sand rocks, somebody was helping Mother climb up the hill, and somebody else was pushing her from behind, and I always wondered why that was, but she told me many years later that was just before my younger brother was born in the 19th of September, 1918. So that somehow made an impression on me, and that's the earliest one I can really pinpoint the time.
And you were how old?
I would have been 3 years old.
Pause it for 1 second. Let me scoot over. So if you look at me, you're looking pretty close to the camera. Talk to us for a few minutes about your parents, what they were like, anything that kind of you remember about them as a child.
Well, they were rather mild people, I would say. I never heard them say an angry word to one another. Their early married life was a little bit troubled, but by the time I came along, I think they'd pretty well got those things settled, and they were, I would say, quite strict. And they weren't abusive or anything, but they just made it known that we had to do what we were told. And one thing that I remember when we were still living up in this house, that one of my cousins, Aaron Parfit, came to stay with us, with Bob and I, and we all three slept in one bed. We got to giggling. I don't know what it was about anymore, but we got to giggling. Dad told us to hush up and go to sleep. Well, we didn't do it. We just kept on giggling and I suppose poking one another, whatever boys do that way. And Dad didn't say any more, but he just got up. And they always kept a strap off of a harness line about that long, and they kept it hanging on the end of the cupboards in the kitchen. He just went out and picked up that strap, and here he came. He'd come over to the bed where we were, and he jerked the covers back, and I happened to be sleeping on the front of the bed, so he grabbed me first and whacked me with that strap several times, and then he grabbed Aaron and whacked him. And I never did think he had strapped him quite as many times as he did me, but then he reached over to the back of the bed and did Bob about the same way, but I don't think he ever struck him as many times as he did me. And I always thought I got the worst of it, but maybe it's just because I was first, I don't know. But that's kind of the way they were. They didn't tell you too many times. And I had a bad habit of getting mad at the supper table and plopping my head down on my arm and just sitting there pouting, I guess. Finally, one night they told me that if that ever happened again, why I was going to eat my supper in the kitchen by myself. You know, a night or two later it happened, and Mother told me later that she just looked over at Dad, and he nodded, and she just reached over and got my plate and took it out to the kitchen and didn't say a word about it. When I looked up, there was no plate in front of me. I knew what I had to do. I went to the kitchen and ate my supper. They were always wanted us to clean our plates. They didn't necessarily say how much we had to eat or what we had to eat, but if we took it, we were supposed to eat it. And if we had any dessert, well then, if you cleaned your plates, you got some dessert. But until you did, you didn't get it any. That's kind of the way they operated. And
what was what were some of the foods that your mom used to make?
Well, I can't really remember anything specific. We just always had good meals. We always had them on time. We was all expected to be there and sit down at the table and eat our supper. And when you got through, you asked to be excused from the table. And if you didn't, you were reminded of it and told to come back and sit down and ask to be excused. And it was always granted, but then it was just something that they thought was necessary, and very much different than today.
What did your dad do?
Well, he was a printer and a carpenter. He was excellent at both of them. And of course, when we lived here in this house, he had a bad case of pneumonia and had to quit the printing business. And I guess that's maybe when he homesteaded. I don't know for sure. Never did know when he filed on this homestead over across the creek where the cave is and the sand rocks. But he just worked on the place there for 2 or 3 or 4 years. I don't know just how long. And then he and Uncle George Wilson went into partnership and started the carpentry business. Well, to go back a little bit, when my dad first came to Craig, he came with his father to build a bank building down on the northeast corner of Yampa Avenue and Victory Way. And that's, at that time, they said that he needed some new shoes, so he went over to the J.W. Hughes Store and bought a pair of shoes, and that's where I met my mother. So,
Talk about the J.W. Hughes stores a little bit since you wrote the book.
well, they were an early day, maybe the first chain store that came into existence. There were probably others that, but they at one time, altogether I found 28 different stores, locations where they had stores, southern Wyoming and Colorado, northwestern Colorado primarily, from Palisade to Parshall, and had one in Rifle and Meeker and Craig, and had Bags and Dixon and Rollins. That's where they started. Well, they actually started in Fort Steele, Wyoming, and then they moved to Rollins, Wyoming, and then spread out from there. Meeker, I think, was the next one they started, and then they just expanded from there. That's, near as I could tell, they only had, the most stores they ever had at one time was 13, but they would buy one and build it up and sell it, and some didn't go, I guess, and they just abandoned them. And they had quite a lot of fires in them. Several of them burned down. One in Meeker burned, and then they built the building that's there at the present time. It's the only one that I know of that's got the Hughes name up on the, and it says the Hughes block up on the top of the building. Is bricked in up there, so it's as permanent as anything is. But they said they sold everything from needles to threshing machines. Mother quit high school when she was 17 years old in 1900 and got this job in the Hughes Company. And she was the first telephone operator in Craig. And the Hughes Company didn't build the telephone lines, but some of the head people of the local stores did. They built this telephone line, and it was just a one-wire line on poles, and then it had to be grounded so that to complete the circuit. So that's the way the first telephones that came in, they didn't even have a switchboard. They just had the phone in the Hughes store, and if they get a call, why, she would answer it and take care of whatever needed to be done. She used to tell the story that R.H. Green, who had a loud voice, they called him Whispering Green. He was the county commissioner, and he had some business to take care of in Denver, so he called to do this, whatever it was he needed to do, and of course he thought he had to talk loud, I guess, to make him hear over there. And so I guess he probably talked pretty loud, but anyway, when he got through, Mother figured up the bill, and it was something like $6, and he threw a fit and said he wouldn't pay it, but he finally did. While we're on that subject, his home was out here where the Taco Bell fast food restaurant is. And one cold morning, I was up at the homestead, and we could hear him talking to his grandsons, telling them what to do around that's how loud his voice was. Of course, it was cold and the voice is carried good. So that's why he got the name of Whispering Green, because
tell us where you went to school.
Wait, cut first.
Oh yeah, cut.
Can we,
Yeah, this all right? If I,
Yeah. Hold on 1 second here. I guess I'll go back over to this side. Okay.
oh, this is the house we lived in. It was 12 by 20 feet. That was our living room. We had 2 beds and a dining table, and I think probably had a crib. And in the wintertime we had a heating stove, and you can see the chimney there in the southwest corner. And that's what 6 of us lived in. And sometime after this picture was taken, Dad built a 10 by 20 foot addition on it, which had the kitchen in it. And evidently we lived in it before that addition was built on it. And I don't remember anything about it, but we must have, because I've got pictures of it. And in the foreground there's it must be a sulky plow, what we call them. It's a one bottom plow that they used to break sagebrush and so forth. And then to the right is they call it a lumber wagon. It had a grain box on it. And then a hay rack to the right of that.
Hold on 1 second, Grandpa. Hold on. Just go back a little ways to just rewind a little bit, whatever you were saying.
Well, as mentioned, the lumber wagon with a grain box on it. And then to the right of that is a hay rack on another wagon. It was an iron-wheeled wagon. Then to the right of that is a binder with my dad driving the 3-horse team binding the grain. And as far as I know, that's me standing out in the picture to the very right of the picture with the town of Craig in the background. And we didn't have any water at this homestead. Dad drilled a well 180 feet deep and got a little bit of soda water. I can remember him bringing about a half a bucket full of water that looked a good deal like milk. It had so much soda in it. It tasted just like if you mix a dose of soda in water and drink it. But that's all he ever got out of it because it caved in. He didn't put enough casing down in the well, and it caved in, and we never did get it fixed. We hauled water from town for everything we used. All it, that wagon, he had 2, I suppose they were 55-gallon barrels, wooden barrels that he hauled water in. Put a cloth over the top of them to keep them from splashing out, water from splashing out when we hauled them home. We'd go down to my grandfather's house and fill it with city water and then haul it home. And that's what we used to drink and cook with and bathe with and mop the floors. And the livestock we had, they all had to go down to the creek to get water. One day we had a young calf that we kept in the barn, and I don't know who took it most of the time, but one day my cousin, she's later known as Stella Wilson, and Bob and I were going to take this calf down to the creek to water it. And we got down below the house a little ways, and the calf kind of acted up and knocked Bob down in There's a mud puddle there, and he got his hands muddy, so nothing would do but he had to go home and wash his hands. Tex got awful mad at him, but because she and I had to take the calf down to the creek to drink. That's just another little incident I remember. Why, I don't know, but we had a crossing of the creek just about directly between where this picture on the left of me is and downtown. That's why we walked mostly to town, except when the creek was high. But, one winter we got a snow about 18 inches of snow, and got up that morning, and Bob and Esther and I had to go to school, and we started breaking trail down through that and going across the creek. And when we got down there, the creek was flooded, and we were afraid to cross it, so we had to go all the way down to the bridge, which is on Victory Way, and then come back to school. And of course, we were late getting to school, but we finally made it. So,
you want to talk about the model that your brother built?
well, that threshing machine model. Yeah, my Uncle George Van Dorn, my dad's youngest brother, built that, I think, probably in the 30s when nobody had any money or no way to go any place. So that's where he spent the winter after he'd feed his cattle and then go work on that. And he made that all by hand, the nuts and bolts and everything he made. And that's a fairly true model of the threshing machines that I later worked on. And there's a steam engine in the background here. That's the way they powered the early threshing machines, was by steam power, and they fired them with, well, sometimes if there was plenty of wood, I guess they'd fire them with wood, but most of them used coal to furnish the heat to make the steam. One time when I was a freshman in high school, and we just had threshed at our house, and then they went to a neighbor's house. Was an old Swiss, he was a Swiss cheesemaker. He had a homestead northeast of Craig here. And Dad came and got me out of class about noon and told me, he took me home after we'd moved over on Fortification Creek, and told me to harness the team and go get some coal out of the coal house and go catch up with the threshing machine because they were out of coal. And so I did. It took me a while, of course, to do it. By the time I caught up with them, they had turned to head straight up the hill, and they'd run out of steam and couldn't go any farther. So, of course, it took them a little while to get the steam back up in the engine so they could pull that separator on up the hill. And he had worked out, and where they were going was over to a place that Elizabeth later owns. Her son Charles Davidson owns it now, and they had a little crop of oats over there, and the guy decided he wanted to sack them, and of course the bundle wagons were all there and all loaded up, ready to, when they got the machine set up, ready to go, and they started thrashing, and it gave me the job of sacking those oats. They had a sacker on them that worked to dump the grain in the sack, and it had a divider on it where you could put the sacks and move them, turn it from one sack to another. And that's the job I had. You know. Those oats came out of that threshing machine so fast it just about worked me to death trying to sack those oats and move them back out of the way. And but,
Okay, Grandpa, why don't you just turn yourself a little bit this way. And you can kind of, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to move some of these signs.
Okay, let's pause for a second. Let's talk a little bit about some of these questions that Janet has from these forms. For instance, what was going on in the world when you were born, and did it affect your family at all?
well, the First World War was going on.
I think his microphone fell off.
Yeah.
Hold
it
on.
did. I was like, what the heck? Why isn't
Can you just check it? Test it, Grandpa?
Testing.
All right, we're good.
Okay, so again, starting over, what was going on in the world, and how, did it affect our family at all?
Well, the First World War was going on when I was born, and of course the United States didn't get into it for a couple of years afterwards, but my dad's youngest brother, George, was drafted eventually, and he went into the service and was sent to France. He didn't ever get into any of the fighting, but he worked in he was in the Signal Corps to start with, and I guess then after the war, when they began to bring the soldiers back out of the trenches, they sent him to a delousing plant where they'd give the guys haircuts and give them a bath and give them new clothes and get the lice off of them. And at that time, lice was quite a, I don't know just what the proper word would be, but they were a terrible nuisance for those soldiers in the trenches that didn't have access to bathing and all that sort of thing. And of course, their hair would get long and those lice would get in there, and there's no way for them to get rid of them until they got out of there and got cleaned up. And that was one of the hazards of the trench warfare, and they don't do that anymore in wars, but they did then. It was. And my dad was too old. He never did get drafted. But other than that, the war itself didn't affect my family any. Some of the depressions afterwards did, but my grandfather and uncle had a ranch up on South Fork, and as a result of the depression after the war, why they lost that. But other than that, I don't know that the war affected us in any way. The only thing I remember about it was going up to Steamboat when Uncle George came home. And really the only thing I remember about that is that around the depot they had, I think they were about 8-inch square posts that were peaked on the ends. They were about 3.5, 4 feet high. They had several of them around the building, I suppose, to protect the building. I never did know exactly why, but they had them around this depot at Craig at one time. And that's the only thing I really remember about when he came home, but I know that's when it was. I guess pretty much the whole family was there to greet him when he got home. He'd been gone for 18 months, and at one time, grandmother and grandfather, none of the family really heard anything from him for months. And they got some of his letters returned. One of them said deceased on it. And that kind of upset the family, of course, but he had just moved around so much that the letters never caught up with him. They eventually returned them. And
Hold on 1 second, Grandpa. Is there a channel to switch to? Does this switch channels? Good. So we'll go back and we'll talk about when Uncle George came home. And then, is he the one, I also want to know, is he the one that's in the picture with the two guys in the World War II uniforms that you sent to me? I can show it to you later. There's a picture of two guys in World War I uniforms.
That was the Pankies, I think.
Oh, that was the
Pankies.
Pankies?
Yeah,
Okay.
that was Emmett.
We'll ask you to talk about them too, but
I've got some pictures of him in his uniforms.
of Uncle George?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
One is a single one, and one of three of his buddies.
Okay. Just to recap, let's have you talk about him. Do you know when he went to the war, how long he was there, and when he came back? And then you could talk about it again when he came back.
Well, I really can't remember the dates when he went in, but I think he probably went in the spring of 1917. No, maybe. No, it was the spring of 1918, and he came back in 1919, but I'm at a loss to tell you exactly when. But he was discharged at Fort D.A. Russell in Cheyenne. It has another name now, but it's the same fort. And he came in on a train, of course, and several of us at least went up to Steamboat. That's where he got off, because that was his home, and out southwest of Steamboat, 12 miles it was out to their place. And so that's where he got off the train, and we went up there, and about all I can remember about it is seeing these posts that they had around the depot that were about, I'd say about 8 inches square, I suppose, and they were peaked so it came to a point on top, and that's about all I really remember, except I know there were several of the family around there. And when he knew he was going to go into the Army, he bought a 1917 Model T Ford, so his folks would have some transportation back and forth to town, so they didn't have to drive a team back and forth. And grandfather was driving at one time, and he run off the road and tipped it over. He never would drive it anymore, but Uncle George drove it then for years afterwards. About 1936, I think, when he bought another one. That would be a good antique for a car buff now, if you could have one like that. By the way, I have the title to it.
Where is it?
It's at home. But,
Not the title, where's the car?
Well, I wish I knew. I'd go.
It's probably over in Ike's, over at Ike's junkyard over there.
Mm-hmm. No, it was long gone before that.
Is that the car that Dad was supposed to inherit? that was gone by the time they went to get it? Or was that old
That was that old Dodge.
Dodge?
No, that was a much later car, but this was an open touring car. I don't know if it even had side curtains, but it had a top that you could let down, so kind of like a convertible nowadays. And this fire engine that's here in the museum is, I think, just a later model of a Model T Ford. You shifted gears with your feet. So your hands, about all you had to do is steer it with your hands. Of course, you had to crank it with a crank out in front. A far cry from these fancy ones they have nowadays.
Did you know any of your great-grandparents?
No, they were all dead before the last one died in 1902.
How many of them can you name? Can you name all of them?
Well, there's Hugh and Catherine Bridgeshear was my grandmother's parents. Aaron and Elizabeth were my grandfather's parents. William Henry Goodwin and Elizabeth Ann Goodwin were my other grandfathers. No, my great-grandmothers. We'll get it straight here in a minute. My grandmother's mother and father. And can't think of the other one, but they were running a hotel in Russellville, Arkansas, and a man came in there with typhoid fever, and they caught it, and my great-grandfather died about 3 days later from typhoid fever. And
Grandfather Goodwin?
no, that was Brian.
Oh.
The name escapes me right now. But. And his wife, my grandfather's mother, died about 3 or 4 days after that in 1876. And she was at least a part Indian. Now, I've never been able to prove that, but that's what my grandfather told me, that she was a quarter Indian. Mother told Gloria that she was an eighth Indian. And I haven't been able to prove either one, but she was born in Connecticut, and her mother was born in Connecticut, so I don't know. I haven't been able to prove it one way or the other.
How many?
Darius was his name. I can't think of her name right now, but I have pictures of all of them.
How many nationalities do you know of that are in your blood? Can you name some?
Yeah, there was Dutch, of course. Her name is Dutch. And then there was English, and there was German, and there was French Huguenots. And of course, if my great-grandmother was part Indian, there was Indian, American Indian. And really, that's all I can think of right at the moment. Some of my ancestors originated, say as far as I know, around Heidelberg, Germany, in that area. The beard shears were German. They were the last ones that I know of that came to this country. They came in 1763, and the others came long before that. The Van Dorns came in, as far as I know, in 1637, and they landed at New Amsterdam, which is now New York City, the lower end of it, of the Manhattan Island. And there were already English people there that eventually became ancestors. So I have no idea when they came here. Their names were Bennett, and there's, of course, many other names. Most of them Dutch. They kind of kept their Dutch heritage for many years. Even after they went to New Jersey, they kind of settled in the same area and kept their Dutch heritage. But eventually they were assimilated into the colonies, and here we are.
Do you know what faith they were?
Well, the Dutch were Dutch Reform. But the rest of them I don't really know. My great-grandfather Beardshear was at least a part-time Christian church preacher. And I'm not just sure how or when the part of the family changed over to Baptist, but they evidently did.
Where were you raised in church? What church did you go to?
Well, when we were small, of course, my mother was I'm not sure she was a charter member, but she was a member of the Congregational Church. And my grandfather, Brian, was one of the two first deacons they had, according to one account that I've read. I never heard him say anything about it, but so Mother used to send us to the Congregational Church when we were little. Then after that, for many years, we didn't go any place. And religion was never brought up in my home. Dad had been a member of the Baptist church, but he didn't attend for many years. But he did build the first. He and Uncle George Wilson built the first Baptist church here in Craig, over on 7th School Street, northwest corner. It's a child care center now. Been added on to a couple of times.
Is that where my parents were married?
No, they were married out to Hamilton.
My parents?
No.
Pete and Joyce.
Pete and Joyce, yeah. Excuse me, I was thinking of George and Laura.
Yeah, they were married in Hamilton.
Hamilton. Yeah, Pete and Joyce were married in that building. Doris and John were too. Gloria was a member there, and after we were married a couple of years, I joined the Baptist church, and that's where we tried to raise our kids.
Can you, just off of that track for a moment, do you have were there any funny things that happened to you as a youngster, or did you get any kind of trouble, or did you ever, any kind of stories that stick out in your mind from growing up?
Well, one that kind of sticks in my mind was that when we were going to the Congregational Sunday School, our Sunday school teacher told us we ought to if our dad smoked, that we should tell him to quit smoking. even back then they were kind of harping on not smoking, but my dad smoked cigarettes or a pipe. He'd switch from one to the other. And one day, Dad and Bob and I were going over to a field north of the house, and the team and lumber wagon, and I was sitting on the seat beside Dad, and Bob was standing up in the back, and Dad pulled out his package of cigarettes and stuck one in his mouth and going to light it up, I guess. And I remembered what my Sunday school teacher told me, and I just reached over and whacked that package of cigarettes, knocked them out on the floor, or out on the ground. And before they hit the ground, I was across Dad's knee, and he was giving me a paddling. So, while all that happened, I hit my nose on the side of the wagon seat and bloodied my nose, and that made me mad. And then he made me get down and pick up all those cigarettes and put them back in the package and hand them back to him. We were saying something about it, and I said, well, you didn't have to bloody my nose. Otherwise, I don't think of too many funny things that happened to us. It was kind of a serious growing up sort of a proposition. Very early on, we were given chores to do, and as we got older, we got more. To begin with, one of the things I remember is having to carry in the coal at night, so we'd have a fire to keep warm. And this house that we lived in over by the Sand Rocks didn't have a ceiling in it. It was just a half-pitched roof, and all there was between us and the sky was some rubberoid and sheeting. So between the cracks, all there was just the rubberoid roofing to keep the heat in. So it wasn't very well insulated, so it took quite a lot of coal to. And Dad had a coal mine in the hill just kind of northeast of the house, and he dug coal one winter too. It wasn't very good coal because I don't think he got in the vein far enough to get into good coal, but it would burn, and that's what we kept warm with.
This was when you were living where exactly?
Here at the homestead, just
North of
on 10th Street,
by the
where the cave is.
cave.
Another thing that I can think of right at the moment, it's a kind of a dirty story, but that's what we did. We knew that the town kids had watered, and they'd like to make mud pies. And so we went and asked Mother, my sister and I went in one day and asked my mother if we could have some water to make some mud pies with. She said no, because they had to haul all their water. And so we went out the north side of the house and proceeded to make our own water, and we made some mud pies. Well, when Mother found out about it, she disapproved of that very strongly. She didn't give us a paddling, but she let us know that that wasn't the thing to do. So.
How old were you?
Oh, I suppose 5 or 6 years old, and she was 4, maybe. I don't remember. We were quite young. I'm sure my younger brother wasn't out very much. Well, now get to thinking about it, another thing that we did one night, we used to like to hobble one another. And like they talk about hobbling the horses so they couldn't wander away. We got some rope or something, and we'd hobble one another, and I don't know what all we did, but it was my younger brother George's turn to be hobbled, so we put the hobbles on him, and all at once he had the urge to go, and so he went outside with these hobbles on, and evidently there was an owl out there, and they hooted in the pitch dark out there, and pretty quick George came back in. He was just as white as a sheet. He was just scared to death of that because that owl had hooted. He couldn't run very fast because he had these hobbles on.
What are hobbles?
Well, they just put a rope around your 2 feet and twist them and tie it around so that you can't walk very. You could just take a few inch steps. That's the way the early days people would keep their horses from running away at night or wandering too far away. They had all kinds of fancy hobbles that they put on them, but they would do that so they wouldn't wander too much, so they'd be easier to find in the morning when they wanted them. That's what we were doing. Another thing I remember, when Dad had a team of mares that he had bred. They had one of them had a colt, and he was about a year old, but he'd never been weaned. We didn't have any corrals or anything, and so Dad came in out of the field one day and tied these team up to the fence post and around the haystack, and fed them some hay so they'd be ready to go back in the afternoon. And this colt came up, wanted to nurse and get you dinner. So I took off and went out, running out there to run him away. And in the meantime, Dad picked up a rock and threw it at the colt to try to run him away. And he hit me right in the back of the head. Cut a gash about an inch long, and it bled and bled and bled. I may still have a scar up there, I don't know, but
Okay, what stories have you heard about your great-grandparents?
well, my great-grandfather Beardshear, Hugh Beardshear, was a one-time Christian church preacher or part-time preacher, or he was also a carpenter. He was up in the Black Hills, South Dakota. I think that was probably in 1879. My grandfather was up there and building a big flume to bring water into Rapid City, South Dakota. That one, probably the last job he worked on. And Aaron Van Dorn was, well, he had some timberland in Iowa around, well, my grandfather was born in Kingston, Iowa, and it was somewhere in that area. It's now Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He had some timberland, and he had a sawmill, and he was going back and forth with his team and wagon, and the team ran away with him, and I suppose threw him out of the wagon. He was injured, and he died 3 or 4 days later from that injury. He was only, I think, 58 years old when he died. His wife, the day of his funeral, she fell down the cellar steps. She was going down to do something and fell down the cellar steps and injured her back, and she was semi-crippled the rest of her life. She lived for maybe close to 30 years that way, as a semi-invalid. Oh, Darius Bryant had a farm around close to Russellville, Arkansas. That's where my grandfather was born, and he raised mules. And he and my great grandmother went to church one day, and they told their boys to. And I don't know why the boys didn't go too, but they didn't. Darius told the boys to leave those mules alone while he was gone. Well, they didn't do it. He went out and was fooling with those mules, and one of them kicked my grandfather in the mouth and knocked out 4 of his teeth. Well, he grew another set of teeth, a third set of teeth. Which is rather unusual, but
Sure is.
and I visited that old place when I got out of the Army in 1945.
Let's take a break. We're almost to the end of this tape, so
Okay.
that way we can. But I think we should do lunch, don't you?